everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne.
Go ahead and get started here. I kind of lost my place in the book, and I was trying to make sure I was on the right chapter. So, I believe we were on chapter 30 starting tonight. And I'm going to read 3 chapters to finish out this part of the book. Yeah, that looks right. Okay. Normally, when I close an electronic book, it keeps my place, but this time it didn't for some reason. All right, so we should be on chapter 30, the cosmic tree and the mill of the gods. In their brilliant and far-reaching study, Hamlet's Mill, professors de Santillana and Van Deschend present a formidable array of mythical and iconographic evidence to demonstrate the existence of a curious phenomenon. For some inexplicable reason and at some unknown date, it seems that certain archaic myths from all over the world were co-opted, no other word will really do, to serve as vehicles for a body of complex technical data concerning the precession of the equinoxes. Sorry, misread that. The importance of this astonishing thesis, as one leading authority on ancient measurement has pointed out, is that it has fired the first salvo in what may prove to be, quote, a Copernican revolution in current conceptions of the development of human culture, end quote. Hamlet's Mill was published in 1969, more than a quarter of a century ago, so the revolution has been a long time coming. During this period, however, the book has been neither widely distributed among the general public nor widely understood by scholars of the remote past. This state of affairs has not come about because of any inherent problems or weaknesses in the work. Instead, in the words of Martin Bernal, professor of government studies at Cornell University, it happened because, quote, few archaeologists, Egyptologists, and ancient historians have the combination of time, effort, and skill necessary to take on the very technical arguments of De Santillana, end quote. What those arguments predominantly concern is the recurrent and persistent transmission of a, quote, processional message, end quote, in a wide range of ancient myths. And strangely enough, many of the key images and symbols that crop up in these myths, notably those that concern a, quote, derangement of the heavens, end quote, are also to be found embedded in the ancient traditions of worldwide cataclysm reviewed in chapters 24 and 25. In Norse mythology, for example, we saw how the wolf Fenrir, whom the gods had so carefully chained up, broke his bonds at last and escaped. Quote, he shook himself and the world trembled. The ash tree Yggdrasil was shaken from its roots to its topmost branches. Mountains crumbled or split from top to bottom. The earth began to lose its shape. Already the stars were coming adrift in the sky, end quote. In the opinion of De Santillana and von Deschend, this myth mixes the familiar theme of catastrophe with the quite separate theme of procession. On the one hand, we have an earthly disaster on a scale that seems to dwarf even the flood of Noah. On the other, we hear that ominous changes are taking place in the heavens and that the stars which have come adrift in the sky are, quote, dropping into the void, end quote. Such celestial imagery repeated again and again with only relatively minor variations in myths from many parts of the world belongs to a category earmarked in Hamlet's Mill as, quote, not mere storytelling of the kind that comes naturally, end quote. Moreover, the Norse traditions that speak of the monstrous wolf Fenrir and the shaking of Yggdrasil go on to report the final apocalypse in which the forces of Valhalla issue forth on the side of order to participate in the terrible last battle of the gods, a battle that will end in apocalyptic destruction. Quote, 500 doors and 40 there are, I ween, in Valhalla's walls. 800 fighters through each door fare. When to war with the wolf they go, end quote. With a lightness of touch that is almost subliminal, this verse has encouraged us to count Valhalla's fighters, thus momentarily obliging us to focus our attention on their total number. 540 times 800 equals 432,000. This total, as we shall see in chapter 31, is mathematically linked to the phenomenon of precession. It is unlikely to have found its way into Norse mythology by accident, especially in a context that has previously specified a derangement of the heavens, quote unquote, severe enough to have caused the stars to come adrift from their stations in the sky. To understand what is going on here, it is essential to grasp the basic imagery of the ancient message that Santillana and von Deschend claim to have stumbled upon. This imagery transforms the luminous dome of the celestial sphere into a vast and intricate piece of machinery, and like a mill wheel, like a churn, like a whirlpool, like a cairn, this machine turns and turns and turns endlessly, its motions being calibrated all the time by the sun, which rises first in one constellation of the zodiac, then in another, and so on all the year round. The four key points of the year are the spring and summer equinoxes and the winter and summer solstices. At each point, naturally, the sun is seen to rise in a different constellation. Thus, if the sun rises in Pisces at the spring equinox, as it does at present, it must rise in Virgo at the autumn equinox, in Gemini at the winter solstice, and in Sagittarius at the summer solstice. On each of these four occasions, for the last 2,000 years or so, this is exactly what the sun has been doing. As we have seen, however, precession of the equinoxes means that the vernal point will change in the not-so-distant future from Pisces to Aquarius. When that happens, the three other constellations marking the three key points will change as well, from Virgo, Gemini, and Sagittarius to Leo, Taurus, and Scorpius, almost as though the giant mechanism of heaven has ponderously switched gears. Like the axle of a mill, Santayana and Van Deschend explain Yggdrasil, quote, represents the world axis, end quote. In the archaic scientific language, they have identified an axis which extends outwards for a viewer in the northern hemisphere to the North Pole of the celestial sphere. Quote, this instinctively suggests a straight, upright post, but that would be an oversimplification. In the mythical context, it is best not to think of the axis in analytical terms, one line at a time, but to consider it and the frame to which it is connected as a whole. As radius automatically calls circle to mind, so axis should invoke the two determining great wheels on the surface of the sphere, the equinoctial and the solstitial colors. Is that colors? It's a weird spelling for colors. It's not the normal OR or OUR. I'm not sure. Anyway, end quote. These colors are the colliers maybe, are the imaginary hoops intersecting at the celestial North Pole, which connect the two equinoctial points on the Earth's path around the Sun, i.e., where it stands on 20 March and 22 September, and the two solstitial points where it stands on 21 June and 21 December. The implication is that, quote, the rotation of the polar axis must not be disjointed from the great circles that shift along with it in heaven. The framework is thought of as all one with the axis, end quote. Santayana and Van Deschend are certain that what confronts us here is not a belief but an allegory. They insist that the notion of a spherical frame composed of two intersecting hoops suspended from an axis is not under any circumstances to be understood as the way in which ancient science envisaged the cosmos. Instead, it is to be seen as a, quote, thought tool, end quote, designed to focus the minds of people bright enough to crack the code upon the hard-to-detect astronomical fact of precession of the equinoxes. It is a thought tool that keeps on cropping up in numerous disguises all over the myths of the ancient world. At the mill with slaves. One example from Central America, which also provides a further illustration of the curious symbolic crossovers between myths of precession and myths of catastrophe, was summarized by Diego de Landa in the 16th century. Quote, among the multitude of gods worshipped by these people, the Maya, were four whom they called the name Bacab. These were, they say, four brothers placed by God when he created the world at its four corners to sustain the heavens lest they fall. They also say that these Bacabs escaped when the world was destroyed by a deluge. End quote. It is the opinion of Santayana and Van Deschend that the Mayan astronomer priests did not subscribe for a moment to the simple-minded notion that the earth was flat with four corners. Instead, they say the image of the four Bacabs is used as a technical allegory intended to shed light on the phenomenon of precession of the equinoxes. The Bacabs stand, in short, for the system of coordinates of an astrological age. They represent the equinoctial and solstitial colliers, binding together the four constellations in which the sun continues to rise at the spring and autumn equinoxes and at the winter and summer solstices for epochs of just under 2,200 years. Of course, it is understood that when the gears of heaven change, the old age comes crashing down and a new age is born. All this, so far, is routine processional imagery. What stands out, however, is the explicit linkage to an earthly disaster, in this case a flood, which the Bacabs survive. It may also be relevant that relief carvings at Chichen Itza unmistakably represent the macabres as being bearded and of European appearance. Be that as it may, the macabre image, linked to a number of badly misunderstood references to, quote, the four corners of heaven, quote, the quadrangular earth, uh, and so on, is only one among many that seem to have been designed to serve as thought tools for procession. Archetypal among these is, of course, the mill of Santayana's title, Hamlet's Mill. It turns out that the Shakespearean character, quote, whom the poet made one of us, the first unhappy intellectual, end quote, conceals a past as a legendary being, his features predetermined, pre-shaped by long-standing myth. In all his many incarnations, this Hamlet remains strangely himself. The original Amlodi, or sometimes Amleth, as his name was in Icelandic legend, quote, shows the same characteristics of melancholy and high intellect. He, too, is a son dedicated to avenge his father, a speaker of cryptic but inescapable truths, an elusive carrier of fate who must yield once his mission is accomplished, end quote. In the crude and vivid imagery of the Norse, Amlodi was identified with the ownership of a fabled mill, or quern, I guess, I'm not sure, Quern, which in its time ground out gold and peace and plenty. In many of the traditions, two giant maidens, Fenja and Menja, were indentured to turn this great contraption, which could not be budged by any human strength. Something went wrong, and the two giantesses were forced to work day and night with no rest. Quote, forth to the mill bench they were brought, to set the grey stone in motion. He gave them no rest nor peace, attentive to the creak of the mill. Their song was a howl, shattering silence. Lower the bin and lighten the stones, yet he would have them grind more. End quote. Rebellious and angry, Fenya and Menya waited until everyone was asleep and then began to turn the mill in a mad whirl until its great props, though cased in iron, burst asunder. Immediately afterwards, in a confusing episode, the mill was stolen by a sea king named Meisinger and loaded aboard his ship together with the giantesses. Meisinger ordered the pair to grind again, but this time they ground out salt. At midnight they asked him whether he was not weary of salt. He bade them grind longer. They had ground but a little longer when down sank the ship. Quote, the huge props flew off the bin, the iron rivets burst, the shaft tree shivered, the bin shot down. End quote. When it reached the bottom of the sea, the mill continued to turn, but it ground out rock and sand, creating a vast whirlpool, the maelstrom. Such images, Santayana and Van Deschend assert, signify a precession of the equinoxes. The axis and iron props of the mill stand for, quote, a system of a system of coordinates in the celestial sphere and represent the fame of a world age. Frame of a world age. Actually, the frame defines a world. Wait a minute. All right, I'm going to start this quote over. I'm sorry. Quote, a system of coordinates in the celestial sphere and represent the frame of a world age. Actually, the frame defines a world age because the polar axis and the colliers form an invisible whole. The entire frame is thrown out of kilter if one part is moved. When that happens, a new pole star with appropriate colliers of its own must replace the obsolete apparatus. End quote. Furthermore, the engulfing whirlpool, quote, belongs to the stock in trade of ancient fable. It appears in the Odyssey as Charybdis in the Straits of Messina, and again in other cultures in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. It is found there too, curiously enough, with an overhanging fig tree to whose bows the hero can cling as the ship goes down, whether it be Satyavrata in India or K in Tonga. The persistence of detail rules out free invention. Such stories have belonged to the cosmographical literature since antiquity. End quote. The appearance of the whirlpool in Homer's Odyssey, which is a compilation of Greek myths more than 3,000 years old, should not surprise us because the great mill of Icelandic legend appears there also, and does so, moreover, in familiar circumstances. It is the last night before the decisive confrontation. Odysseus, bent on revenge, has landed in Ithaca and is hiding under the magical spell of the goddess Athena, which protects him from recognition. Odysseus prays to Zeus to send him an encouraging sign before the great ordeal. Quote, straightway Zeus thundered from shining Olympus, and goodly Odysseus was glad. Moreover, a woman, a grinder at the mill, uttered a voice of omen from within the house hard by, where stood the mills of the shepherd of the people. At these hand mills 12 women in all plied their task, making meal of barley and of wheat, the marrow of men. Now all the others were asleep, for they had ground out their task of grain, but this one alone rested not, yet, being the weakest of all. She now stayed her quern, and spake the word, May the enemies of Odysseus on this day for the last time make their sweet feasting in his halls. They that have loosened my knees with cruel toil to grind their barley meal, may they now sup their last. End quote. Santayana and Van Deschen argue that it is no accident that the allegory of the quote, orb of heaven that turns around like a millstone and ever does something bad, end quote, also makes an appearance in the biblical tradition of Samson. Quote, eyeless in Gaza, in eyeless in Gaza at the mill with slaves, end quote. His merciless captors unbind him so that he can make sport, quote unquote, for them in their temple. Instead, with his last strength, he takes hold of the middle pillars of that great structure and brings the whole edifice crashing down, killing everybody. Like Fenya and Menya, he gets his revenge. The theme resurfaces in Japan, in Central America, among the Maoris of New Zealand, and the Maoris. Maoris, I think is how that's pronounced, of New Zealand, and in the myths of Finland. There, the Hamlet/Samson figure is known as Kullervo, and the mill has a peculiar name, the Sampo. Like Fenya and Menya's mill, it is ultimately stolen and loaded on board a ship, and like their mill, it ends up being broken in pieces. It turns out that the word Sampo has its origins in the Sanskrit skambha, Skambha, meaning pillar or pole, and in the Atharva Veda, one of the most ancient pieces of North Indian literature, we find an entire hymn dedicated to the skamba. Quote, in whom earth atmosphere, in whom sky is set, where fire, moon, sun, wind stand fixed, the skamba sustains both heaven and earth. The skamba sustains the wide atmosphere. The skamba sustains the 6 wide directions. Into the skamba entered all existence. End quote. Whitney, the translator, Atharvaveda 10:7, comments in some perplexity, quote, skamba literally prop, support, pillar, strangely used in this hymn as frame of the universe, end quote. Sorry, some of that is abbreviated in a way. It took me a minute to figure out what he was doing there. Yet with an awareness of the complex of the complex of ideas linking cosmic mills and whirlpools and world trees and so on, the archaic Vedic usage should not seem so strange. What is being signaled here is, as in all the other allegories, is the frame of a world age. That same heavenly mechanism that turns for more than 2,000 years with the sun rising always in the same four cardinal points, and then slowly shifts those celestial coordinates to four new constellations for the next couple of thousand years. This is why the mill always breaks, why the huge props always fly off the bin in one way or another, why the iron rivets burst, why the shaft tree shivers. Precession of the equinoxes merits such imagery because at widely separated intervals of time, it does indeed change or break the stabilizing coordinates of the entire celestial sphere. Openers of the way. What is remarkable about all this is the way that the mill, which continues to serve as an allegory for cosmic processes, stubbornly keeps on resurfacing all over the world, even where the context has been jumbled or lost. Indeed, in Santayana and von Deschen's argument, it doesn't really matter if the context is lost. Quote, the particular merit of mythical terminology, they say, is that it can be used as a vehicle for handing down solid knowledge independently from the degree of insight of the people who do the actual telling of the stories, fables, etc. End quote. What matters, in other words, is that certain central imagery should survive and continue to be passed on in retellings, however far these may drift from the original storyline. An example of such drift, coupled with the retention of essential imagery and information, is found among the Cherokees, whose name for the Milky Way, our own galaxy, is "where the dog ran." Quote unquote. In ancient times, according to Cherokee tradition, the quote, people in the south had a corn mill, end quote, from which meal was stolen again and again. In due course, the owners discovered the thief, a dog, who, quote, ran off howling to his home in the north with the meal dropping from his mouth as he ran and leaving behind a white trail where now we see the Milky Way, which the Cherokee call to this day "where the dog ran." End quote. In Central America, one of the many myths concerning Quetzalcoatl depicts him playing a key role in the regeneration of mankind after the all-destroying flood that ended the fourth sun. Together with his dog-headed companion Xolotl, he descends into the underworld to retrieve the skeletons of the people killed by the deluge. This he succeeds in doing after tricking Mictlantecutli, the god of death, and the bones are brought to a place called Tamawanchan. Uh, there, like corn, they are milled into a fine meal on a grindstone. Upon his Upon this ground meal, the gods then release blood, thus creating the flesh of the current age of men. Santayana and von Deschen do not think that the presence of a canine character in both the above variants of the myth of the cosmic mill is likely to be accidental. They point out that Kullervo, the Finnish Hamlet, is also accompanied by, quote, the black dog Musti, end quote. Likewise, after his return to his estates in Ithaca, Odysseus is first recognized by his faithful dog, and as anyone who has been to Sunday school will remember, Samson is associated with foxes, 300 of them to be precise, which are members of the dog family. In the Danish version of the Amleth/Hamlet saga, quote, Amleth went on, and a wolf crossed his path amid the thicket, end quote. Last but not least, an alternative recension of the Kullervo story from Finland was the hero, rather weirdly, being, quote, sent to Estonia to bark under the fence. He barked 1 year, end quote. Santayana and von Deschen are confident that all this doggishness is purposive. Another piece of the ancient code, as yet unbroken, persistently tapping out its message from place to place. They list these and many other canine symbols among a series of morphological markers, quote unquote, which they have identified as likely to suggest the presence in ancient myths of scientific information concerning precession of the equinoxes. These markers may have had meanings of their own or been intended simply to alert the target audience that a piece of hard data was coming up in the story being told. Bilingually, sometimes they may also have been designed to serve as openers of the way, quote unquote, conduits to enable initiates to follow the trail of scientific information from one myth to another. Thus, even though none of the familiar mills and whirlpools is in sight, we should perhaps sit up and pay attention when we learn that Orion, the great hunter of Greek myth, was the owner of a dog. When Orion tried to ravish the virgin goddess Artemis, she produced a scorpion from the earth which killed him and the dog. Orion was transported to the skies where he became the constellation that bears his name today. His dog was transformed into Sirius, the dog star. Precisely the same identification of Sirius was made by the ancient Egyptians, who linked the Orion constellation specifically to their god Osiris. It is in ancient Egypt, too, that the character of the faithful celestial dog achieves its fullest and most explicit mythical elaboration in the form of Upuaut. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. That's my first guess. A jackal headed deity whose name means opener of the ways. If we follow this way opener to Egypt, turn our eyes to the constellation of Orion, and enter the potent myth of Osiris, we find ourselves enveloped in a net of familiar symbols. The reader will recall that the myth presents Osiris as the victim of a plot. The conspirators initially dispose of him by sealing him in a box and casting him adrift on the waters of the Nile. In this respect, does he not resemble Utnapishtim and Noah and Coxcoxtli and all the other deluge heroes in their arks or boxes or chests riding out the waters of the flood? Another familiar element is the classic processional image of the world tree and or roof pillar, in this case combined. The myth tells us how Osiris, still sealed inside his coffer, is carried out into the sea and washed up at Byblos. The waves lay him to rest among the branches of a tamarisk tree, which rapidly grows to a magnificent size, enclosing the coffer within its trunk. The king of the country, who much admires the tamarisk tree, cuts it down and fashions the part which contains Osiris into a roof pillar for his palace. Later, Isis, the wife of Osiris, removes her husband's body from the pillar and takes it back to Egypt to undergo rebirth. The Osiris myth also includes certain key numbers. Whether by accident or by design, these numbers give access to a science of precession, as we shall see in the next chapter. So that is the end of that chapter. So moving right on into chapter 31. Which is titled The Osiris Numbers. Archaeoastronomer Jane B. Sellers, who studied Egyptology at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, spends her winters in Portland, Maine, and summers at Ripley Neck, a 19th century enclave down east on Maine's rocky coast. There, quote, there, she says, the night skies can be as clear as the desert, and no one minds if you read the pyramid text out loud to the seagulls, end quote. One of the few serious scholars to have tested the theory advanced by Santayana and Van Deschend in Hamlet's Mill, Sellers has been hailed for having drawn attention to the need to use astronomy, and more particularly precession, for the proper study of ancient Egypt and its religion. In her words, quote, archaeologists by and large lack an understanding of precession, and this affects their conclusions concerning ancient myths, ancient gods, and ancient temple alignments. For astronomers, precession is a well established fact. Those working in the field of ancient man have a responsibility to attain an understanding of it. End quote. It is Sellers' contention, eloquently expressed in her recent book, The Death of Gods in Ancient Egypt, that the Osiris myth may have been deliberately encoded with a group of key numbers that are, quote unquote, excess baggage, as far as the narrative is concerned, but that offer an eternal calculus by which the surprisingly exact values can be derived for the following. 1. The time required for the Earth's slow precessional wobble to cause the position of the sunrise on the vernal equinox to complete a shift of 1 degree along the ecliptic in relation to the stellar background. 2. The time required for the sun to pass through one full zodiacal segment of 30 degrees. 3. The time required for the sun to pass through 2 full zodiacal segments totaling 60 degrees. And 4. The time required to bring about the Great Return, i.e., for the sun to shift 360 degrees along the ecliptic, thus fulfilling one complete precessional cycle or great year. Computing the Great Return. The precessional numbers highlighted by Sellers in the Osiris myth are 360, 72, 30, and 12. Most of them are found in a section of the myth which provides us with biographical details of the various characters. These have been conveniently summarized by E. A. Wallace Budge, formerly keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, and also one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, by the way. Oh no, Budge. What am I thinking? I was thinking A.E. Waite. I was mixing up the two people. I apologize. Budge is the, yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. I completely smushed two historical figures together there. Oh, the quote. That's where I was. Quote, the goddess Nut, wife of the sun god Ra, was beloved by the god Geb. When Ra discovered the intrigue, he cursed his wife and declared that she should not be delivered of a child in any month of any year. Then the god Thoth, who also loved Nut, played at tables with the moon and won from her 5 whole days. These he joined to the 360 days of which the year then consisted, emphasis added. On the first of these 5 days, Osiris was brought forth, and at the moment of his birth, a voice was heard to proclaim that the Lord of creation was born. End quote. I don't know why I mixed up those two people. That's stupid of me. Anyway, elsewhere, the myths informs us that the 360-day year consists of 12 months of 30 days each. And in general, as Sellers observes, quote, phrases are used which prompt simple mental calculations and an attention to numbers, end quote. Thus far, we have been provided with 3 of Sellers' precessional numbers, 360, 12, and 30. The 4th number, which occurs later in the text, is by far the most important. As we saw in chapter 9, the evil deity known as Set led a group of conspirators in a plot to kill Osiris. The number of these conspirators was 72. With this last number in hand, suggests Sellers, we are now in a position to boot up and set running an ancient computer program. 12 equals the number of constellations in the zodiac. 30 equals the number... Oh, this is a quote, by the way. Sorry. 12 equals the number of the constellations of the zodiac. 30 equals the number of degrees allocated along the ecliptic to each zodiacal constellation. 72 equals the number of years required for the equinoctial sun to complete a precessional shift of 1 degree along the ecliptic. 360 equals the total number of degrees in the ecliptic. 72 times 30 equals 2160, the number of years required for the sun to complete a passage of 30 degrees along the ecliptic, i.e., to pass entirely through any one of the 12 zodiacal constellations. 2160 times 12, or 360 times 72, equals 25,920, the number of years in one complete precessional cycle or great year, and thus the total number of years required to bring about the great return. End quote, I guess. Other figures and combinations of figures also emerge. For example, quote, 36, the number of years required for the equinoctial sun to complete a precessional shift of half a degree along the ecliptic. 4320, the number of years required for the equinoctial sun to complete a precessional shift of 60 degrees, i.e., 2 zodiacal constellations. End quote. These, the seller believes, constitute the basic ingredients of a precessional code which appears again and again with eerie persistence in ancient myths and sacred architecture. In common with such esoteric numerology, it is a code in which it is permissible to shift decimal points to left or right at will and to make use of almost any conceivable combinations, permutations, multiplications, divisions, and fractions of the essential numbers, all of which relate precisely to the rate of precession of the equinoxes. The preeminent number in the code is 72. To this is frequently added 36, making 108, and it is permissible to multiply 108 by 100 to get 10,800, or to divide it by 2 to get 54, which may then be multiplied by 10 and expressed as 540, or as 54,000, or as 540,000, or as 5,400,000, and so on. Also highly significant is 2160, the number of years required for the equinoctial point to transit one zodiacal constellation, which is sometimes multiplied by 10 and by factors of 10 to give 216,000, 2,160,000, and so on, and sometimes by 2 to give 4320, or 43,200, or 432,000, or 4.32 million ad infinition. It says ad infinition. Okay, I've never seen it written that way. Better than Hipparchus. If Sellers is correct in her hypothesis that the calculus needed to produce these numbers was deliberately encoded into the Osiris myth to convey processional information to initiates, we are confronted by an intriguing anomaly. If they are indeed about procession, the numbers are out of place in time. The science they contain is too advanced for them to have been calculated by any known civilization of antiquity. Let us not forget that they occur in a myth which is present at the very dawn of writing, in Egypt. Indeed, elements of the Osiris story are to be found in the pyramid text dating back to around 2450 BC, in a context which suggests that they were exceedingly old even then. Hipparchus, the so-called discoverer of precession, lived in the 2nd century BC. He proposed a value of 45 or 46 seconds of arc for 1 year of precessional motion. These figures yield a 1 degree shift along the ecliptic in 80 years, at 45 arc seconds per annum, and in 78.26 years at 46 arc seconds per annum. The true figure, as calculated by 20th century science, is 71.6 years. If Sellers' theory is correct, therefore, the Osiris numbers, which give a value of 72 years, are significantly more accurate than those of Hipparchus. Indeed, within the obvious confines imposed by narrative structure, it is difficult to see how the number 72 could have been improved upon, even if the more precise figure had been known to the ancient myth-makers. One can hardly insert 71.6 conspirators into a story, but 72 will fit comfortably. Working from this rounded up figure, the Osiris myth is capable of yielding a value of 2160 years for a precessional shift through one complete house of the zodiac. The correct figure, according to today's calculations, is 2148 years. The Hipparchus figures are 2400 years and 2347.8 years, respectively. Finally, Osiris enables us to calculate 25,920 as the number of years required for the fulfillment of a complete precessional cycle through 12 houses of the zodiac. Hipparchus gives us either 28,800 or 28,173.6 years. The correct figure by today's estimates is 25,776 years. The Hipparchus calculations for the Great Return are therefore around 3,000 years out of kilter. The Osiris calculations miss the true figure by only 144 years and may well do so because the narrative context forced a rounding up of the base number from the correct value of 71.6 to a more workable figure of 72. All this, however, assumes that Sellers is right to suppose that the numbers 360, 72, 30, and 12 did not find their way into the Osiris myth by chance, but were placed there deliberately by people who understood and had accurately measured precession. Is Sellers right? Uh, what? I'm not sure what you're asking. Times of decay. The Osiris myth is not the only one the, is not the only one to incorporate the calculus for precession. The relevant numbers keep surfacing in various forms, multiples, and combinations all over the ancient world. An example was given in chapter 33, the Norse myth of the 432,000 fighters who sallied forth from Valhalla to do battle with the wolf. A glance back at that myth shows that it contains several permutations of precessional numbers. Likewise, as we saw in chapter 24, ancient Chinese traditions refer to a universal cataclysm were said to have been written down in a great text consisting of precisely 4,320 volumes. Thousands of miles away, is it a coincidence that the Babylonian historian Berosus, 3rd century BC, ascribed a total reign of 432,000 years to the mythical kings who ruled the land of Sumer before the flood? And is it likewise a coincidence that this same Berosus ascribed 2,160,000 years to the period, quote, between creation and universal catastrophe, end quote? Do the myths of ancient Amerindian peoples like the Maya also contain or enable us to compute numbers such as 72, 2,160, 4,320, etc.? We shall probably never know, thanks to the conquistadors and zealous friars who destroyed the traditional heritage of Central America and left us so little to work with. What we can say, however, is that the relevant numbers do turn up in relative profusion in the Mayan long count calendar. Details of that calendar were given in chapter 21. The numerals necessary for calculating the precession are found there in these formulas. 1 katun equals 7,200 days. 1 ton, TUN, equals 360 days. 2 tons equals 720 days. 5 baktons equals 720,000 days. 5 katons equals 36,000 days. 6 katons equals 43,200 days. 6 tons equals 2,160 days. 15 katons equals 160,000 days. Nor does it seem that Sellers' code is confined to mythology. In the jungles of Kampuchea, the temple complex of Angkor looks as though it could have been purpose built as a processional metaphor. It has, for example, 5 gates, to each of which leads a road bridging the crocodile infested moat that surrounds the whole site. Each of these roads is bordered by a row of gigantic stone figures, 108 per avenue, 54 on each side, 540 statues in all, and each row carries a huge Naga serpent. Furthermore, as Santayana and Van Deschend point out in Hamlet's Mill, the figures do not carry the serpent but are shown to pull it, which indicates that these 540 statues are quote unquote churning the Milky Ocean. The whole of Angkor, quote, thus turns out to be a colossal model set up with true Hindu fantasy and incongruousness, end quote, to express the idea of procession. Okay, and then we have a picture here. Um, Churning the Milky Ocean, one of the several thought tools for procession encountered in ancient myths, is the caption. So I will show you that. There we go. All kinds of symbols all over the place here. Okay, moving on with the reading. The same may be true of Java's famous temple of Borobudur, with its 72 bell-shaped stupas, and perhaps also of the megaliths of Baalbek in the Lebanon, which are thought to be the world's biggest blocks of cut stone. Long predating Roman and Greek structures on the site, the three that make up the so-called Trilithion are as tall as 5-story buildings and weigh over 600 tons each. A fourth megalith is almost 80 feet in length and weighs 1,100 tons. Amazingly, these giant blocks were cut, perfectly shaped, and somehow transported to Baalbek from a quarry several miles away. In addition, they were skillfully incorporated at a considerable height above ground level into the retaining walls of a magnificent temple. This temple was surrounded by 54 columns of immense size and weight. In the subcontinent of India, where the Orion constellation is known as Kalpurush, meaning time man, we find that Sellers's Osiris numbers are transmitted through a wide range of media in ways increasingly difficult to ascribe to chance. These are, for instance, 10,800 bricks in the Agnikayana, the Indian fire altar. There are 10,800 stanzas in the Rig Veda, the most ancient of the Vedic texts, and a rich repository of Indian mythology. Each stanza is made up of 40 syllables, with the result that the entire composition consists of 432,000 syllables, no more and no less. And in Rigveda 164, a typical stanza, we read of, quote, the 12-spoked wheel in which 720 sons of Agni are established, end quote. In the Hebrew Kabbalah, there are 72 angels through whom the Sephiroth, divine powers, may be approached or invoked by those who know their names and numbers. Rosicrucian tradition speaks of cycles of 108 years, 72 plus 36, according to which the secret brotherhood makes its influence felt. Similarly, the number 72 and its permutations and subdivisions are of great significance to the Chinese secret societies known as triads. An ancient ritual requires that each candidate for initiation pay a fee, including, quote, 360 cash for making clothes, 108 cash for the purse, 72 cash for instruction, and 36 cash for decapitating the traitorous subject. End quote. The cash, the old universal brass coin of China with a square hole in the center, is of course no longer in circulation, but the numbers passed down in the ritual since times immemorial have survived. Thus, in modern Singapore, candidates for triad membership pay an entrance fee, which is calculated according to their financial circumstances, but which must always consist of multiples of $1.80, $3.60, $7.20, $10.80, and thus $18, $36, $72, $108, or $360, $720, and $1,080, and so on. Of all the secret societies, the most mysterious and archaic by far is undoubtedly the Hung League, which scholars believe to be, quote, the depository of the old religion of the Chinese, end quote. In one Hung initiation ritual, the neophyte is put through a question and answer session that goes, question, what did you see on your walk? Answer, I saw 2 pots with red bamboo. Question, what do you know how many plants there were? Answer, in one pot were 36 and in the other 72 plants, together 108. Question, did you take home some of them for your use? Answer, yes, I took home 108 plants. Question, how can you prove that? Answer, I can prove it by a verse. Question, how does this verse run? Answer, the red bamboo from Canton is rare in the world. In the groves are 36 and 72. Who in the world knows the meaning of this? When we have set to work, we will know the secret. Okay, that's the end of the question and answer. The atmosphere of intrigue that such passages generate is accentuated by the reticent behavior of the Hung League itself, an organization resembling the medieval European Order of the Knights Templar and the higher degrees of modern Freemasonry, in many ways that are beyond the remit of this book to describe. It is intriguing, too, that the Chinese character Hung, composed of water and many, signifies inundation, i.e., the flood. Finally, returning to India, let us note the content of the sacred scriptures known as the Puranas. These speak of 4 quote-unquote ages of the earth called yugas, which together are said to extend to 12,000 divine years. The respective durations of these epochs in divine years are Krita Yuga, equaling 4,800, Treta Yuga 3,600, Dvapara Yuga 2,400, and Kali Yuga 1,200, which we may learn a bit more about when I finally get around to reading some Blavatsky. I know she talks about the Yugas in Isis Unveiled, or is it The Secret Doctrine, or maybe it's both. Anyway, the Purunas also tell us that, quote, 1 year of the mortals is equal to 1 day of the gods, end quote. Furthermore, exactly as in the Osiris myth, we discover that the number of days in the years of both gods and mortals has been artificially set at 360, so 1 year of the gods is equivalent to 360 mortal years. The Kali Yuga, therefore, at 1,200 years of the gods, turns out to have a duration of 432,000 mortal years. 1 Mahayuga, or Great Age, made up of the 1,200 divine years contained in the 4 lesser yugas, is equivalent to 4,320,000 years of mortals. 1,000 such Mahayugas, which constitute a kalpa, or day of Brahma, extend over 4,320,000,000 ordinary years. Again supplying the digits for basic processional calculations. Separately, there are Manvantaras, periods of Manu, of which we are told in the scriptures that, quote, about 71 systems of 4 yugas elapse during each manvantara. The reader will recall that. Where's the end of the quote? Okay. I don't see the end of it. The reader will recall that 1 degree of precessional motion along the ecliptic requires 71.6 years to complete, a number that can be rounded down to about 71 in India just as easily as it was rounded up in 72 in ancient Egypt. So, yeah, he has a quote. He starts a quote, but he doesn't have an ending for that quote. So that threw me off a bit. The Kali Yuga, with a duration of 432,000 mortal years, is, by the way, our own, quote, in the Kali age, end quote. This, uh, in the wow, I really read that poorly. Um, the Kali Yuga is, by the way, our own. That was basically what he was saying there. And then, quote, in the Kali age, the scriptures say, shall decay flourish until the human face approaches annihilation, end quote. Dogs, uncles, and revenge. It was a dog that brought us to these decaying times. We came here by way of Sirius, the dog star, who stands at the heel of the giant constellation of Orion, where it towers in the sky above Egypt. In that land, as we have seen, Orion is Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, whose numbers, perhaps by chance, are 12, 30, 72, and 360. But can chance account for the fact that these and other prime integers of precession keep cropping up in supposedly unrelated mythologies from all over the world, and in such stolid but enduring vehicles as calendar systems and works of architecture? Santayana and von Deschend, Jane Sellers, and a growing body of other scholars rule out chance, arguing that the persistence of detail is indicative of a guiding hand. If they are wrong, we need to find some other explanation for how such specific and interrelated numbers, the only obvious function of which is to calculate precession, could by accident have got themselves so widely imprinted on human culture. But suppose they are not wrong. Suppose that a guiding hand really was at work behind the scenes. Sometimes when you slip into Santayana's and von Deschend's world of myth and mystery, you can almost feel the influence of that hand. Take the business of the dog or jackal or wolf or fox. The subtle way this shadowy canine slinks from myth to myth is peculiar, stimulating, then baffling you, always luring you onwards. Indeed, it was this lure we followed from the mill of Amlodi to the myth of Osiris in Egypt. Along the way, according to the design of the ancient sages, if Sellers, Santayana, and von Deschend are right, we were first encouraged to build a clear mental picture of the celestial sphere. Second, we were provided with a mechanistic model so that we could visualize the great changes precession of the equinoxes periodically affects in all the coordinates of the sphere. Finally, after allowing the dog Sirius to open the way for us, we were given the figures to calculate precession more or less exactly. Nor is Sirius, in his eternal station at Orion's heel, the only doggish character around Osiris. We saw in chapter 11 how Isis, who was both the wife and sister of Osiris, searched for her dead husband's body after he had been murdered by Set, who incidentally was also her brother and the brother of Osiris. In this search, according to ancient tradition, she was assisted by dogs, jackals in some versions. Likewise, mythological and religious texts from all periods of Egyptian history assert that the jackal god Anubis ministered to the spirit of Osiris after his death and acted as his guide through the underworld. Surviving vignettes depict Anubis as virtually identical in appearance to Upuaut, the opener of the ways. I don't know. I know I'm butchering that name. I'm sorry. It's spelled Upuaut. Your guess is probably better than mine. Last but not least, Osiris himself was believed to have taken the form of a wolf when he returned from the underworld to assist his son Horus in the final battle against Set. Investigating this kind of material, one sometimes has the spooky sense of being manipulated by an ancient intelligence which has found a way to reach out to us across vast epochs of time and for some reason has set us a puzzle to solve in the language of myth. If it were just dogs that kept cropping up again and again, it would be easy to brush off such weird intuitions. The dog phenomenon seems more likely to be coincidence than anything else, but it isn't just dogs. The ways between the two very different myths of Osiris and Amlodi's mill, which nonetheless both seem to contain accurate scientific data about precession of the equinoxes, are kept open by another strange common factor. Family relationships are involved. Amlodi slash Amleth slash Hamlet is always a son who revenges the murder of his father by entrapping and killing the murderer. The murderer, furthermore, is always the father's own brother, i.e., Hamlet's uncle. This is precisely the scenario of the Osiris myth. Osiris and Seth are brothers. Seth murders Osiris. Horus, the son of Osiris, then takes revenge upon his uncle. And for some reason, I just had a sudden thought of The Lion King. That's the story of The Lion King, too. Another twist is that the Hamlet character often has some sort of incestuous relationship with his sister. In the case of Kullervo, the Finnish Hamlet, there is a poignant scene in which the hero, returning home after a long absence, meets a maiden in the woods gathering berries. They lie together. Only later do they discover that they are brother and sister. The maiden drowns herself at once. Later, with, quote, the black dog Musti, end quote, padding along at his heels, Kullervo wanders into the forest and throws himself upon his sword. There are no suicides in the Egyptian myth of Osiris, but there is the incest of Osiris and his sister Isis. Out of their union is born Horus the Avenger. Okay, that part's not in The Lion King. So once again, it seems reasonable to ask, what is going on? Why are there all these apparent links and connections? Why do we have these strings of myths ostensibly about different subjects, all of which prove capable in their own ways of shedding light on the phenomenon of precession of the equinoxes? And why do all these myths have dogs running through them and characters who seem unusually inclined to incest, fratricide, and revenge? It surely drives skepticism beyond its limits to suggest that so many identical literary devices could keep on turning up purely by chance in so many different contexts. If not by chance, however, then who exactly was responsible for creating this intricate and clever connecting pattern? Who were the authors and designers of the puzzle, and what motives might they have had? Scientists with something to say. Whoever it was, they must have been smart enough to have observed the infinitesimal creep of precessional motion along the ecliptic and to have calculated its rate at a value uncannily close to that obtained by today's advanced technology. It therefore follows that we are talking about highly civilized people. Indeed, we are talking about people who deserve to be called scientists. They must, moreover, have lived in extremely remote antiquity, because we can be certain that the creation and dissemination of the common heritage of the processional myths on both sides of the Atlantic did not take place in historic times. On the contrary, the evidence suggests that all these myths are quote-unquote tottering with age when what we call history began about 5,000 years ago. The great strength of the ancient stories was this: as well as being forever available for use and adaptation free of copyright, like intellectual chameleons, subtle and ambiguous, they had the capacity to change their color according to their surroundings. At different times in different continents, the ancient tales could be retold in a variety of ways, but would always retain their essential symbolism and always continue to transmit the coded processional data they had been programmed with at the outset. But to what end? As we see in the next chapter, the long, slow cycles of precession are not limited in their consequences to a changing view of the sky. This celestial phenomenon, born of the Earth's axial wobble, has direct effects on the Earth itself. In fact, it appears to be one of the principal correlates of the sudden onset of ice ages and their equally sudden and catastrophic decay. And that is the end of chapter 31. So the next one is a very short chapter. We're going to finish it up. That'll finish section 5 of the book. And then we will go see if there's somebody around that we want to raid. So chapter 32 is Speaking to the Unborn. It is understandable that a huge range of myths from all over the ancient world should describe geological catastrophes in graphic detail. Mankind survived the horror of the last ice age, and the most plausible source for our enduring traditions of flooding and freezing, massive volcanism, and devastating earthquakes is in the tumultuous upheavals unleashed during the Great Meltdown of 15,000 to 8,000 BC. The final retreat of the ice sheets and the consequent 300 to 400 foot rise in the global sea levels took place only a few thousand years before the beginning of the historical period. It is therefore not surprising that all our early civilizations should have retained vivid memories of the vast cataclysms that had terrified their forefathers. Much harder to explain is the peculiar but distinctive way the myths of cataclysm seem to bear the intelligent imprint of a guiding hand. Indeed, the degree of convergence between such ancient stories is frequently remarkable enough to raise the suspicion that they must all have been written by the same author. Could that author have been anything have start that again? Could that author have had anything to do with the wondrous deity or superhuman spoken of in so many of the myths we have reviewed, who appears immediately after the world has been shattered by a horrifying geological catastrophe and brings comfort and the gifts of civilization to the shocked and demoralized survivors? White and bearded, Osiris is the ancient manifestation of this universal figure, and it may not be an accident that one of the first acts he is remembered for in myth is the abolition of cannibalism among the primitive inhabitants of the Nile Valley. Viracocha in South America was said to have begun his civilizing mission immediately after a great flood. Quetzalcoatl, the discoverer of maize, brought the benefits of crops, mathematics, astronomy, and a refined culture to Mexico after the fourth sun had been overwhelmed by a destroying deluge. Could these strange myths contain a record of encounters between scattered Paleolithic tribes which survived the last ice age and an as yet unidentified high civilization which passed through the same epoch? And could the myths be attempts to communicate a message in the bottle of time? Quote, of all the other stupendous inventions, end quote, Galileo once remarked, quote, what sublimity of mind must have been his who conceived how to communicate his most secret thoughts to any other person, though very distant either in time or place, speaking with those who are in the Indies, speaking to those who are not yet born, nor shall be this 1,000 or 10,000 years, and with no greater difficulty than the various arrangements of 24 little signs on a paper. Let this be the seal of all the admirable inventions of men. End quote. If the processional message identified by scholars like Santiana van Deschend and Jane Sellers is indeed a deliberate attempt at communication by some lost civilization of antiquity, how come it wasn't just written down and left for us to find? Wouldn't that have been easier than encoding it in myths? Perhaps. Not to mention, he was already mentioned that thanks to overzealous friars and the Catholic Church, I'm not going to beat around the bush on that one. We've lost a hell of a lot of documents that could have very well spelled it all out for us. Anyway, I digress. Nevertheless, perhaps that what I'm sorry. Nevertheless, suppose that whatever the message was written on got destroyed or worn away after many thousands of years. Or suppose that the language in which it was inscribed was later forgotten utterly, like the enigmatic Indus Valley script, which has been studied closely for more than half a century, but has so far resisted all attempts at decoding. It must be obvious that in such circumstances, a written legacy to the future would be of no value at all because nobody would be able to make sense of it. What one would look for, therefore, would be a universal language, the kind of language that would be comprehensible to any technologically advanced society in any epoch, even 1,000 or 10,000 years into the future. Such languages are few and far between, but mathematics is one of them, and the city of Teotihuacan may be the calling card of a lost civilization written in the eternal language of mathematics. Geodetic data related to the exact positioning of fixed geographical points and to the shape and size of the Earth would also remain valid and recognizable for tens of thousands of years and might be most conveniently expressed by means of cartography or in the construction of giant geodetic monuments like the Great Pyramid of Egypt, as we shall see. Another constant in our solar system is the language of time, the great but regular intervals of time calibrated by the inchworm creep of precessional motion. Now, or 10,000 years in the future, a message that prints out numbers like 72 or 2160 or 4320 or 25,920 should be instantly intelligible to any civilization that has evolved a modest talent for mathematics and the ability to detect and measure the almost imperceptible reverse motion that the sun appears to make along the ecliptic against the background of the fixed stars. 1 degree in 71.6 years, 30 degrees in 2,140 years, 48 years, and so on. The sense that a correlation exists is strengthened by something else. It is neither as firm nor as definite as the number of syllables in the Rig Veda. Nevertheless, it feels relevant. Through powerful stylistic links and shared symbolism, myths to do with global cataclysms and with precession of the equinoxes quite frequently intermesh. A detailed interconnectedness exists between these two categories of tradition, both of which additionally bear what appear to be the recognizable fingerprints of a conscious design. Quite naturally, therefore, one is prompted to discover whether there might not be an important connection between precession of the equinoxes and global catastrophes. Mill of Pain. Although several different mechanisms of an astronomical and geological nature seem to be involved, and although not all of these are fully understood, the fact is that the cycle of precession does correlate very strongly with the onset and demise of ice ages. Several trigger factors must coincide, which is why not every shift from one astronomical age to another is implicated. Nevertheless, it is accepted that precession does have an impact on both glaciation and deglaciation. At widely separated intervals, the knowledge that it does so has only been established by our own science since the late 1970s. Yet the evidence of the myths suggests that the same level of knowledge might have been possessed by an as yet unidentified civilization in the depths of the last ice age. The clear suggestion we may be meant to grasp is that the terrible cataclysms of flood and fire and ice, which the myths describe, were in some way causally connected to the ponderous movements of the celestial coordinates through the great cycle of the zodiac. In the words of Santayana and Van Deschend, quote, "It was not a foreign idea to the ancients that the mills of the gods grind slowly and that the result is usually pain." End quote. Three principal factors, all of which we have met before, are now known to be deeply implicated in the onset and retreat of ice ages, together, of course, with the diverse cataclysms that ensue from sudden freezes and thaws. These factors all have to do with variations in the Earth's orbital geometry. They are 1. The obliquity of the ecliptic, i.e., the angle of tilt of the planet's axis of rotation, which is also the angle between the celestial equator and the ecliptic. This, as we have seen, varies over immensely long periods of time between 22.1 degrees, the closest point that the axis reaches to vertical, and 24.5 degrees, the furthest it falls away from the vertical. 2. The eccentricity of the orbit, i.e., whether the Earth's elliptical path around the sun is more or less elongated in any given epoch. 3. Axial precession, which causes the four cardinal points on the Earth's orbit, the two equinoxes and the winter and summer solstices, to creep backwards very, very slowly around the orbital path. We are dipping our toes into the water of a technical and specialized scientific discipline here, one largely outside the scope of this book. Readers seeking detailed information are referred to the multidisciplinary work of the U.S. National Science Foundation's KLIMAP project and to a keynote paper by Professors J.D. Hayes and John Embry entitled Variations in the Earth's Orbit, Pacemaker of the Ice Ages. Briefly, what Hayes, Embry, and others have proved is that the onset of ice ages can be predicted when the following evil and inauspicious conjunctions of celestial cycles occur. A. Maximum eccentricity, which takes the Earth millions of miles further away from the Sun at aphelion, the extremity of its orbit, than is normal. B. Minimum obliquity, which means that the Earth's axis and consequently the north and south poles stand much closer to the vertical than is normal. And C. Precession of the equinoxes, which, as the great cycle continues, eventually causes winter in one hemisphere or the other to set in when the Earth is at perihelion, its closest point to the sun. This in turn means that summer occurs at aphelion and is thus relatively cold, so that ice laid down in winter fails to melt during the following summer, and a remorseless buildup of glacial conditions occurs. Levered by the changing geometry of the orbit, global insolation, the differing amounts and intensity of sunlight received at various latitudes in any given epoch can thus be an important trigger factor for ice ages. Is it possible that the ancient myth makers were trying to warn us of great danger when they so intricately linked the pain of global cataclysms to the slow grinding of the mill of heaven? This is a question we will return to in due course, but meanwhile it is enough to observe that by identifying the significant effects of orbital geometry on the planet's climate and well-being, and by combining this information with precise measurements of the rate of precessional motion, the unknown scientists of an unrecognized civilization seem to have found a way to catch our attention, to bridge the chasm of ages, and to communicate with us directly. Whether or not we listen to what they have to say is, of course, entirely up to us. And that is the end of that chapter 32, which is also the end of part 5 of the book. So the next book will be, or the next part of the book will be part 6, the Giza Invitation, Egypt 1, starting with chapter 33. So that is where we will pick up next Tuesday. So for now, let's go see what Mr. Blitzer's doing. He is still on. So we'll go see. He may be getting close to the end of his session, but we'll go raid him anyway. So bear with me a minute. Give him a couple minutes of your time, and I'll take us on over there. I'll see you there.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated.